begin to get the place to think between ethics and architecture. And Tim this evening is going to talk about ethics and the cultural construction of place, moral geographies, and the ethical consideration of distant places. Tim is Reader in Geography at Royal Holloway at the University of London, and his main research is between geography and philosophy and in rural change, particularly in the peripheral parts of Europe. He's the author of The Place of Geography in 1992 and editor of a new journal, which I think now you'll find in the library, called Ethics, Place and Environment, the first issue of which will be published in March, or the order for which is placed in the library. He was Honorary Secretary of the Royal Geographical Society from 1995 to 1997. It's a pleasure to welcome Tim Unwin.
It's nice to have some applause at the beginning. I hope in about an hour's time you will feel the same. I have a confession to make also. That Jacqueline had said, well, you could talk for any length of time you want. You know, some people go on for 2 hours. And I thought she was serious. So I've probably prepared far too much material to cover. I will endeavour to finish by 22 minutes to 8. So I'll try and keep it to an hour. I was also warned that I had to have lots of photographs, so if you get bored with what I'm saying, you'll be able to see something that I hope may challenge you to think a little bit more about ethics and place, and perhaps to begin with, you can be thinking about why and where that is and what the ethical implications are. If we can very briefly just run through the outline of what I'd like to say. The other thing, I haven't got a gadget to make this one work. Click it again. That's it. I'm a geographer and proud of being a geographer, although there does come an architectural influence at one point. And so really what I'm going to be talking about is the linkages mainly between geography and ethics. And as Mark said, exploring the ways in which geographers have increasingly turned to understanding the importance of the links between what we mean and understand by place and the ethical implications thereof. So a little bit about geography to begin with, and then I'll try and not say any more about it. And then we will move on to looking at the role of ethics in the cultural constructions of place. And then I will try and examine questions about the nature of moral geographies. Because it was in the work of people like Felix Driver, and I think some of you may be familiar with that, where the beginnings in the 1980s of geographers' engagement with what moral places were came into existence. My own particular concern is with more distant places, and you may be familiar with a set of debates about distant strangers. In a sense, we're going to be moving through these themes, perhaps from the more material to the more conceptual and the more philosophical, because depending how much time I have at the end, I want to conclude with questions about universalism and relativism, problems that I haven't fully come to grips with myself, but really the postmodern challenge to the Enlightenment project. Something that I'm looking at in some considerable detail, and particularly to a reworking of some of Locke's ideas and seeing the extent to which they remain relevant to this day. And then I will keep it very briefly, some conclusions, which will try and draw it all together. Public lectures like this, I suppose, should be full of certainty and full of absolutes. From what I've already said about challenges to the Enlightenment, if that's what you're wanting this evening, I apologise, you're not going to get it. Dealing with ethics, I think I want to raise a number of questions that those of us who will be able to be at the seminar tomorrow can perhaps explore in more detail. But to accept that certainty is highly problematic, and in such a mixed audience, we all come to this position from very different cultural backgrounds. So to begin by looking at geography and ethics, and to begin with a personal agenda. And when I was a child, I think I spent most of the time, did any of you remember something called Baco, which was constructing buildings out of iron rods and little bits of plastic. And that came after Lego. It's a great honour, actually, to be here, because I was, at the age of, I think, about 6, absolutely determined to become an architect. And if I wasn't going to become an architect, I was going to become an engineer. And I finished up as a geographer. Well, in a sense, those early footsteps in an architectural tradition, my father was very proud that he said, "Tim, did you know you had a member of your family who was once a famous architect?" And I said no, and whenever people were telling me about urban planning, I tried to run away as fast as I could. This wasn't one of Raymond Unwin's designs, but I remember when I was in Durham on the staff there, I had a colleague who may be known to some of you, who was trying, we went around the various new towns of Durham, which this is not, and he used to say, well, it's not the buildings that are wrong, it's the people that are wrong. And I think as a geographer, that set me thinking really along the path, an exploration of the linkages between place and ethics and the role of buildings. And in a sense, this is taken from Grantorp near Stockholm, and the social experimentation associated with different types of building. There are numerous links, though, between geography and architecture. And as I said, it's not only an honour, it's a privilege to be here, because I think there is tremendous opportunity to be done in research and in actually very practical applications at the interface between our two disciplines. Many of you are familiar with the work of cultural geographers, such as Dennis Cosgrove, who have explored the development of landscape ideas, landscape architecture, and cultural geographies. But also, we can think of the work of David Harvey and others on urban theory, the ways in which, in his more recent work, he has come back to questions of justice and equality in understanding the contemporary urban environment. I think both geographers and architects are fundamentally concerned with the relationship between a physical material world and a cultural world. The linkages whereby we can look at the ways in which the physical world shapes our understanding of cultural values, but also the other way round, the ways in which our own interpretations of our cultures help us explore that nature, that physical world. Nature, of course, being very much a cultural construct. So both of us are looking at how things are shaped by and yet shape human beings. But I also have, in looking at ethics and place, a very much a practical intent. What are our own ethical involvements with particular places? And this, in a sense, is an introduction to this question of distant strangers that I will come back to at the end. What are our ethical involvements with places? Not only as professionals, but also as individuals. What do places do to us? How do we as individuals value particular different places? And there are also very close connections with our ethical understanding of images and images. Does that sharpen up? Images of particular places. Ethics and images. All of the slides here are in a sense, constructs and images themselves. We could talk a long time about why they were chosen. I don't particularly want to. I hope you will be able to understand the story that goes through them. So geography. And again, please. Geography is, as I'm sure you are familiar, although it'd be quite interesting to do a straw poll about what your interpretations and understandings of geography were from your previous incarnations, those of your youth. But geography is now very far distant from just being about maps and about capes and bays. Geography is a discipline that has, like others, been shaped by recent political changes in our country and in other countries. But particularly since some innovative work by people like Jim Proctor in Santa Barbara and Bill Lynn in Minnesota, but also David Smith, whose works I'm sure some of you are familiar with at Queen Mary and Westfield College. Geographers have increasingly returned to an ethical consideration. But, as in any discipline, there are multiple voices. Again, I think this is a fun slide. I hope you can all see the black rabbit at the sort of right-hand side. This is really the important thing here. Not all the eminent geographers are around. I haven't many photographs of geographers, but these are geographers. And really, they don't speak the same language as the rabbit, but they're interested by the rabbit. Anyway, a moral of multiplicity of voices and no certainty, and really an engagement with a whole range of different issues that I cannot possibly cover this evening. But if I had to be pinned down and say what I understood very briefly geography to be, certainly for the purposes of tonight, it is a concern with place, both in terms of physical human reciprocity. There one even used the word dialectic, the interactions between the physical world and the human world, but also in the structures that determine place. I'm in great danger of sounding like an unreconstructed structuralist here, but I think it is helpful in our understanding of the ways in which places are created to reflect on a range of social factors that have influenced the nature of place. Here is undoubtedly a place that we could talk about numerous ethical dimensions, but also an economic, not just in terms of production of energy in this case, but in terms of consumption and exchange. Undoubtedly a series of political factors, and it's in the political arena that we can begin to explore, I think, some of the most pressing considerations of environment and place today. And then also ideological factors, the ideology not only of Christianity, but of other religions. And it is those, in a sense, that I want to take a bit further this evening. If I could have the next set of slides. So, the linkages between geography and ethics and moral philosophy. I don't want to digress too far here, but to set a little bit of context. Moral philosophy, like geography, like, I imagine, architecture, has numerous diverse interpretations. But it's no coincidence that as we move towards the end of the millennium, there is increasing recognition of the everyday relevance of ethics to our daily lives. And I rather like this quotation from Singer that we see above. Ethics deals with values, with good and bad, with right and wrong. We cannot avoid involvement in ethics, for what we do is always a possible subject of ethical evaluation. And in a sense, perhaps my own introduction to this discourse has come very, very much in terms of a reconsideration of the scientific approach in geography. And certainly my readings of Habermas and his arguments in terms of critical theory, and the way in which he suggests that science, in a sense, removes all ethical considerations about what it does, so that we do not have to question the value of science. Now, in geography, there was a long, in the 1960s and 1970s, and I think the same is true in part in architecture, a long history of scientific domination of what we did, an unquestioning certainty in truth that was scientific truth. And it is in the challenges to that from a whole range of directions that my own introductions to exploring ethical considerations came about. But as with our own disciplines, there is a wide diversity in moral philosophy. I like to think that we can consider really three broad approaches, and it's these three approaches that I want to intersect with a discussion of place this evening. There is metaethics, or what Hare has called the language of morals, the ways in which we frame our moral discourses. Secondly, there are normative ethics, solutions for moral questions, what should be. And then descriptive ethics, the identification of beliefs and moral practices. And I would like to suggest that geographers' concerns with space, with place, and with nature are all fundamentally tied up with ethical questions. And what I'd like to do this evening is just explore the ways in which, or a number of ways in which we might take that analysis further. And taking that threefold division. I want to begin, in a sense, at the third with descriptive ethics and look at some work that geographers and others have been doing on the ways in which places are culturally constructed. So I'd see that as being the intersection between place and descriptive ethics. Turning to normative ethics, there are three examples that I would like to pursue. And I think it's here probably that geographers have paid most attention. The points I made earlier about the nature of moral geographies, my own particular concerns with distant places, and here I'll draw quite heavily on the work of Stuart Corbridge, and very briefly, but I suppose for me fairly painfully, questions of professional ethics. Mark mentioned that I was Honorary Secretary of the Royal Geographical Society. Well, I was actually Honorary Secretary of the Institute of British Geographers, and some of you may be familiar, you may have seen the debates in the press, but we then merged with the Royal Geographical Society, and that raised a series of profound ethical considerations. I may run out of time to say a great deal about that, but I will at least allude to it, and it'll be quite interesting in discussions or afterwards to think about, or for me to hear about your own professional ethics in architecture. And then finally, and much more philosophically, questions of meta-ethics in geography. And here to explore some questions relating to relativism and universalism, moving away from more traditional arguments about absolute and relative natures of arguments, but a focus on the universals and the debate between libertarianism and communitarianism. So, let us embark on the empirical side. How do we value places? How do we value places? That is a profoundly ethical question. What criteria do we use to consider allocating some kind of moral position to a place? Far too often, I would suggest this has been seen primarily in economic terms. But not only in economic terms. Here we can see the tradition in Scandinavia. This, I think, is taken from Aarhus, of reconstructing previous places itself, the moral considerations in that process. But that there is a value in the past as understanding the present. But really three sets of questions. How, and perhaps more interestingly, why do we value different places? A question that we will all seek to answer in different ways. But that also, in deciding whether places are somehow good or less good or even evil, we ascribe meaning to those places. And then too, there are a whole series, and geographers and environmentalists have been deeply concerned with this idea of sustainability, the rights and wrongs of different environmental practices. But is sustainability itself a moral case or a moral argument? And I want to tease some of these ideas out by looking at three particular examples, all of which, in a sense, have resulted from my own empirical work in different parts of the world. First of all, to explore and examine some ideas of the meaning of forest, something I'm finding particularly fascinating at the moment in some research I'm doing in Eastern Europe. Secondly, and I'm going to get this terribly wrong because you're going to know far more about it than I do, but 20 years ago at the University of Durham, I had to lecture on urban design in India and the Middle East. And this brought me into contact with a number of architects. And I want to say a little bit about moral frameworks for different religious architectures. And then to draw on an entirely different tradition, to look at other ways, other cultural understandings of ethics in place, and to take as example Aboriginal dreamings in Australia. So, understanding forest. What do we think of when we think of forests? Most, gross generalization, I apologize, but many British people, and certainly when I talk to student audiences, undergraduate audiences. Forest is somehow, to them, something alien, something other, even something evil. How do we assign value to forests? This is about as near as you get to a forest in England. It's a forest with a particular tradition and a particular legend. It is a forest of bandits and outlaws. The forest is a place for outlaws. It's Sherwood Forest, the major oak. I'm sure you all recognised it. For English people, the idea of Robin Hood and forest ascribes a particular set of images. But those images are profoundly different from other cultural constructions of forest. I'm sure some people in the audience will have read Simon Schama's Memory and Landscape, where he goes back to his own cultural background in Latvia, here in northern Latvia. And here he understands forest in an entirely different way. It has an entirely different set of values. But forest, rather than being alien and other and dark, forest is home. And that is a home that he contrasts very much with a different tradition, a Roman tradition and a Christian tradition. For East Germanic peoples, as he sees the Latvians, the forest was where they defeated the Roman legions. The forest was where they withdrew into their own cultural and religious practices when the missionaries of Christianity came to destroy their known world. The forest was undoubtedly home. Now, I haven't done much work in Latvia myself, but certainly there is imagery and powerful meaning in Estonia, where I've been doing some work over the last 5 or 6 years. The Finno-Ugric understanding of nature is something very, very different from that which we have here. Shamanism or shamanism is still practiced. There is an anecdote here. There's a person called Vigala Sas, who many people still believe in, who survived with his shamanic practices throughout the Soviet era. But he's an astute man because he's now marketing gin called Alexander gin, made from traditional herbal remedies taken from his panoply of linkages with nature. But here we can see, in a sense, a very practical response to the changing societies there. But it isn't just in traditional Finno-Ugric mythology or religious beliefs that the forest is important. Yes, there is that element, but to Estonians, the forest is something very much more. The forest was where resistance to Soviet occupation was most strong. There was the Forest Brotherhood, who lived and fought from the forests, with the last forest brother, I think in the mid-1970s only, committing suicide rather than handing himself over to the occupying force. People lived underground, hidden away in forests. So the forest is profoundly important for Estonian national identity. But forest itself takes different forms. Here is a typical Estonian raba or marsh bog in the middle of the forest that provided natural protection around the belts of forest. And if you walk through Estonian forests with Estonians, everything in the forest has meaning and value in a way that our forests certainly don't, from the mushrooms to the berries to the different sorts of wood and timber. So value is important. But forests, if we just draw this little empirical example to an end, forests we can see as both good and evil, depending on how we look at them, depending on our cultural background. And this touches on questions of, well, how universal are particular human relationships with nature? And nature itself, yes, culturally constructed, but the same physical objects, trees, have very different meanings in very different cultures. And I'll come back to that at the end when I explore some of these issues about universalism. So the first example was forest. If we now turn to questions of moral frameworks and religious architectures, and this is where I said I would be treading on difficult water, but essentially I want to explore the way, very briefly, in which material responses to religious beliefs have profoundly ethical dimensions. Perhaps ask a question that I guess many of you have asked, or at least debated in seminars. How do we frame a discourse of religious architectures? How do we frame a discourse of religious architectures? And there are numerous debates and discussions and arguments related to this, but I want to, in a sense, touch on three particular issues. How do architectures, the material things that we design, relate to particular sacred texts? And what's the relationship between those sacred texts and the buildings or objects that we design? Secondly, questions about what we determine as beautiful or valued, I would suggest, relate profoundly to ethical considerations of place. Is this beautiful or not? How do we decide? And then there are, of course, debates over the creation of new styles in old religions, the ways in which technological change, new materials can impinge on old ideologies. And I want to do that really by looking at two particular examples. Firstly, to look very briefly at some Hindu architecture, really through work and experiences that I had there in the late 1970s in particular. But looking at the text, the Manasara, which again I'm sure many of you know in much more detail than I do. But that emphasizes very, very much that architecture has a profoundly religious role. And I think if one were to talk about the religious role of architecture in British society, one might think that time to move on. But that the science of architecture has come down from Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu, and that there are clear ways of designing buildings that are better than others. Ethical issues come into it. There is a good and an evil in particular building designs. And particularly if a building is constructed defectively, the evil consequences that will derive from that. And then we can look at how later traditions have built on that and influenced it and changed it. We can think of the transformations of traditional Hindu architecture, first by Muslim beliefs, and then, of course, by British conquests, and the way in which our understanding of traditional Hindu architecture is mediated through a series of layers that have come from these different traditions. Perhaps most notably, in the way, for example, in which Lutyens has reinterpreted Hindu architecture and Muslim architecture in the Delhi Sultanate in some of his buildings that he designed for imperial India, or in the actual symbols and emblems of that imperial power themselves. And the fact that these still survive itself, another ethical dimension of the place of modern India. And then, if we have the next series of debates, really in the early 1980s, over whether or not there is a specific Arab or Muslim architecture. The enormous affluence and wealth from oil revenues of the late 1970s and 1980s made this a profoundly practical issue, and certainly many British architects were eager to get a share of that income in designing appropriate buildings, appropriate town plans for some of these burgeoning cities. A mosque here in a hotel in Medina. Or, to make this a little more blatant, prohibited area for non-Muslims. What would happen if you crossed that line? The debates over whether or not there were Arab cities or Muslim architectures, I'm sure, continue. Are there particular architectural features that belong to any one religion? A particular shape of an arch? Or what many will want to see as being typically Arab and Islamic, mashrabiyas, in this case, an old example from Jeddah, but some of, I think, wonderful buildings still survive, although in fairly dilapidated form. House design. Are there particular Arab or Muslim houses? Are they worth restoring? Are they worth retaining? Who decides? Questions about the nature of a distinctly Arab city with its private and its public places. Here is a private place overlooking a public place. The gender divisions of places that are seen as being so important. But all of this is also, of course, tied up with a search for a new Muslim Islamic identity. But is that it? This is the new souk that was built in Sharjah, seeking to combine a range of different traditional elements. I think my own conclusion on this issue is that there are key environmental parameters, again, that as much shape the architecture as the architecture is shaped by. If we take another famous Arab city, I think we could scarcely say that this has many of the traditional features of the new Arab city. And certainly the minaret calling people to look heavenwards, to listen to the sounds of prayer, the call to prayer, to oversee, to dominate, is now itself vastly dominated by the material and financial considerations of the modern Western world. So there are a set of debates and issues relating to religious influences there in Islamic architecture. The next dimension that I said I would look at, and again through very Western European eyes in this case, is something I've become increasingly interested in. Not so much in the search as do people like Callcott, who are looking for some kind of universal understandings of the human relationship with nature, but rather to look at alternatives to our own Western ways of looking at places. People like Deborah Bird Rose and others have emphasized that in our own ethics in the West, we tend to focus very much on dualisms, on good and evil, male, female. The range is infinite. But that these dualisms are profoundly alien to traditional Aboriginal thought. Now again, this is something I've only recently started exploring, and I can't see in the distance of the audience, but I'm sure if there are any Australian Aboriginal architects here, they will put me right where I go wrong. But profoundly different ethical codes, totally different ways understanding place, and I would like to suggest that there are ways which by reflecting an alternative perspective on our own ethical understandings of place can encourage us to look in different ways. I'll begin with this quotation from Sutton, who argues that in traditional Aboriginal thought there is no central dichotomy of the spiritual and material, the sacred and secular, or the natural and supernatural. while each of the dreaming beings and their physical counterparts and manifestations, be they animals, plants, waterholes, rock formations of people, are distinguishable, dreamings and their visible transformations are also, at a certain level, one. And we might ask, what are the architectures of dreamings? Deborah Bird-Rose, whose work I have already briefly mentioned, I think has, from an anthropological tradition, developed a profound understanding of the Aboriginal understanding of place, of nature, and of dreaming. And she suggests that the earth as she is now, covered with vegetation, marked by different landforms, home to a great variety of living things, is a visible and consultable record of origins. Those who know how to look can see in the earth a story of our beginnings. Those who have the knowledge to understand can find in this visible story the meaning and the purpose of life. Next slide. So what are dreamings in a little more rigorous summary? Dreamings are, on the one hand, ancestral beings, but they have continued vitality. As Rose argues, they come before and continue to exist. They are eternally present. And their spirits are passed on to those who know how to read and how to understand them. The dreaming is, in a very real sense, a generating principle, the way in which the present is formed, but is also, and I think if I were to pursue this further in an architectural sense, it's an organizing logic in art, and dare one also suggest, in architecture. And again, an example here taken from northeast Arnhem Land. I'm sorry I haven't any, but there are issues of copyright and how one presents Aboriginal art. To conclude this section on dreamings. Now, one of my interests that Mark didn't mention is viticulture, and my trip to Australia was mainly to look at photographing vineyards, which are, of course, non-Aboriginal at all, but the bloodwood trees here, again, provide a linkage with Aboriginal meanings and understandings of place. Because the Aboriginal construction of subjectivity isn't anything like our understanding, that we understand the subjective, the individual, through a whole series of multiple presences, and that those multiple presences shape how we see places, or as they tend to be called in Aboriginal arguments, the country. And Rose has, in a sense, if we use the word place instead of country, Rose has suggested different slices, different ways in which we can seek to grapple with this very complex identity. If we say place instead of country, place is somehow an environment which gives life and receives life. It consists of the dreamings, but the animals, the plants, people. And rather than a way in which we see humans as owning and managing particular places and particular lands, instead, humans, in Aboriginal argument, are created for each country. A profoundly different set of moral implications. And as she goes on, country or places have origins and a future. And in a sense, in the way that all humans are created for each country, so are other things created for that country. All living things have an interest in the country. And here we can see quite close links with some more recent arguments amongst geographers and economists and others as well, about arguments about sustainability. The essence of country is this multidimensional linkage. The lives of any one part depend deeply and intimately on the lives of every other part of the country. So much then for geography and descriptive ethics. I'd now like to turn to a discussion of the linkages between place and normative ethics, and particularly look at three aspects of this. As I said earlier, moral geographies, distant places, and then very briefly something on professional ethics. So if we could have the first here. Previously, much moral geography was concerned with descriptive ethics, with the codification, the description of a whole series of moral differences to do with class, ethnicity, as I've said here, religious beliefs, and political conviction. The ways in which we have different kinds of ethical place, different kinds of moral places. In particular, a series of studies on moral order in the Victorian city, the way in which the Victorians shaped a particular set of moral places and immoral places. Felix Driver's work on sanatoria and on madness are particularly apposite here. But this heritage, of course, still survives today, with the designation of particular places in London, for example, as having particular moral value or moral order, and the ways in which those moralities and those descriptions change. One need only think of for example, the changing moralness of Soho. I would suggest, though, that many geographers, and this is perhaps not true of architects, but have been reluctant to engage in normative ethics. And really, I could suggest two or three reasons for this. And what I want to hint is that we should be engaging in questions of normative ethics. The first has been a failure of normative arguments elsewhere. Spatial laws are long since dead. The geography of the quantitative revolution of the 1960s and 70s is no more. Normative arguments have failed. But then, so too have other arguments. And again, here is where my own interests, particularly in Eastern Europe of late, have come to the fore. What is the heritage of Marxist theory? Communism in inverted commas, the left in inverted commas, has failed. Lenin is now merely on the scrap heap if he hasn't been melted down altogether. And the radical traditions, certainly in my own discipline, have tended to seek a refuge in critique. Critique is safe, but critique doesn't provide normative arguments. It cannot provide them. It is much safer to develop arguments which suggest that other people's arguments are wrong, but that in lived practice, in profoundly moral and ethical terms, leave nothing to say. And I think this, if we challenge that element of critique, it then raises a set of fairly difficult moral geographies and moral questions about the nature of place, because it forces us to ask, what should places be like? And it strikes me that that is a question which you engage on a day-to-day level. Well, what kind of place is that? What does it do to you? What does it make you feel like? How does this place, or at least my image of it, or if those of you who've been to Charlotte, a city which I find extraordinary, how does that place influence behaviour? And how does that place influence behaviour perhaps in a different way to this place? And note that the river has had masses of green dye poured into it. This is Chicago on St. Patrick's Day. How does place influence behaviour? And of course the human influence by painting it green. And then the political questions. Who determines how different places are constructed? And in many ways you do. Is it your paymasters? Is it your ethical principles? Is it your artistic creation? Of course, places are not only constructed physically, they're places in the mind as well. And it's here that I think we begin to move into a set of debates over the linkages. This is perhaps where we get a bit theoretical, but debates over communitarianism and liberalism. Walser's critique of rules, for example. But I'll come back to rules in more detail when I consider distant places. For me, these sets of arguments are particularly pertinent in the post-Soviet era, in the reconstruction and replanning of East European and former Soviet cities. As we can see here, the example of Tallinn, one of the classic medieval cities of the southern Baltics. And the ways in which the creation of so-called liberal democracies and the power of the free market are in a very real sense shaping the new places of Eastern Europe. But places for whom? Are they truly democracies? Here we see new private houses being built at vast expense on the periphery of Tartu, while people living in rural areas find it very, very difficult to maintain any kind of productive existence. We all know about the Coca-Colaization and the McDonaldization, if that word actually exists, of parts of the world. Here we see McDonald's in Torun in Poland. The ways in which new places are being shaped by market forces. And perhaps one of my favourite illustrations here is Barbie. This was taken immediately after independence in Estonia. Barbie in the windows of a money exchange, a money change, and a whole load of other things as well, and a child looking inquisitively in. Places within places, the place of Barbie's doll's house in a new kind of Europe. If we continue on a slightly more theoretical vein, we can explore questions that these illustrations have raised in terms of the nature of places and people's rights to live in particular places. And this, in a sense, provides a connection between my arguments about normative moral geographies and questions about distant places and distant peoples. And we can think of Thomas Hobbes's arguments about the right people have for a place to live. But what kind of place is that? And who determines what kind of place it is? Again, deeply ethical considerations. While Hobbes might have argued that people have a right to a place to live, I don't think that necessarily means, certainly in his formulation, that need necessarily be a specific place. Birthplaces are not purely accidents. Life chances, in a very real sense, falling out of the side of a house, life chances are determined as much by place as place is determined by the ways in which different cultures, economies, and societies shape them. And here we can see an area around a mosque in Tbilisi and the various different religious communities that seek to live there side by side. But moving here to Georgia, that raises a whole series of complex and difficult questions to do as much as anything else with restrictions on migration. What rights does one group of people have to shape where another group of people lives? They're fundamental, normative, moral questions considering migration at a range of scales. One can think of that in terms of national and international boundaries, the ways in which the meaning of Britain is shaped as a place is shaped by the external controls we have over people moving in. But brought home, to me, at any rate, very much in terms of, for example, the separatist movements, each in seeking their own places in the Republic of Georgia. This is the Hotel Ivaria in Tbilisi, again in Georgia, which was, in those of you who may have been there in the Soviet period, the top hotel in town, now totally full of refugees from South Ossetia and Abkhazia. in terms of the devastating civil war that has taken place there. Net suggests that free movement of people is a civil right that we are not actually ready for. Right, 10 minutes and I will conclude. The connection between distant places and normative geographies and normative ethics brings to mind a series of debates in the ethics literature about distant places. It's the classic moral question: does distance make a difference? Does our response to what happens here in Bihar, in northern India, which might look a very pleasant, nice, green, lush place, but also a place where there is enormous poverty and begging and blindness and harsh reality, does our relationship to that distant place differ from our response to moral questions about near places? Not, I'm afraid, on the streets of London, but this on the streets of Dublin. And Ginsberg has explored in his work in the earlier part of this decade these moral questions in some detail. And I really want to just raise them to think about in terms of shaping our understanding of the ethics in place. And he traces historical approaches in Western society to this classic issue, beginning with Aristotle: the nearness of the terrible makes men pity, but when it is far off, we tend not to pity, to Balzac's conundrum: would you murder an old Chinese mandarin without actually doing it, but just by saying he will die, if that would make you wealthy? And so the question is, therefore, does proximity by itself, nearness, make a moral difference? And if so, why? And the two standard arguments that one might make in response to that are that the I becomes we when there is some kind of relational identity. In other words, nearness, we are created out of an I that only sees something a long way away as something separate. But I think it's also, to some extent, our understanding of this in Western philosophy, at any rate, owes a lot to Locke here, that we know things by sensual perception. By the way, if we actually feel something, then we know it much more deeply and intimately than we do by any other kind of knowledge. So these classic questions about distance are related to a whole series of arguments in development ethics. And very briefly, I want to explore a couple of these. The first is perhaps of most interest in current debates about the nature of globalization and the shaping of the world economy. That, in a sense, affluence in one part of the world must be associated with an increase in poverty elsewhere. And yet, distance is in many ways becoming much closer. Space-time compression, the development of mass media, the portrayal of images in our television sets is in a sense a way of breaking down distance, but does it make a difference in terms of our ethical responses to it? Very briefly, I think, in view of the time, if we could just click through two of the next illustrations and not say much about the development model, and we move on to the next one. Thank you. Brings us to questions about the needs and the rights of distant strangers. And I think here some of the work of Stuart Corbridge, if you're not familiar with it, is certainly worth reading. Because he argues that we need to seek some kind of middle way between the radical views of the right and the radical views of the post-left concerning how we deal ethically with these needs and rights of people such as these. He suggests that from the right there are a set of arguments that the dominant ethical and moral principles are that people should have a right to lead free lives. But that is countered by the fact that people from Bihar or southern Georgia here should not have any claims on the assets of other countries. These are countered by arguments on the left, by people, to some extent, Escobar and others, that development itself is a totally flawed and failed argument, and we need alternatives to the idea of development, an emphasis on local communities, an ending of the modernist traditions of the development principles. Stuart Corbridge suggests that both of these are really based essentially on caricatures of developmentalism. And in seeking to find a way out of these ethical problems and dilemmas, he builds on Rawls' social contract theory of justice. But to that, to his minimalist position, he adds a universalism. He suggests that we do indeed have moral obligations to distant others, but that these needn't be seen in the ways in which they're traditionally formulated by the right and what he calls the post-left. He suggests we have a responsibility to signpost the means or the ways by which a commitment can indeed be made to meeting basic human needs around the world, and to signal the opportunity costs that might be associated with any particular policy commitments. But this can only be done in particular places. Therefore, we only have moral obligations and ethical concerns when dealing with particular places and peoples. Right, let's move on a couple, and you can ask me about professional ethics and the difficult dilemmas that geographers have faced in questions afterwards. Suffice it to say, if we just click on, let's leave it there just for a second. Geographers were faced with the issue of corporate sponsorship, and some of you may have read in the media one of the corporate benefactors of the Royal Geographical Society was Shell, and geographers are meant to be deeply concerned with the environment, and so a whole set of quite interesting professional ethics questions arose in terms of whether that sponsorship should continue or not. And out of that came a number of debates over whether or not professional academics should have codes or guidelines of particular practices. Right, the final thing I wanted to say a little bit about was the debates in terms of ethics and place between relativism and universalism. And here I said, yes, I would get a little bit theoretical, and I'm running out of time rapidly, so this will be a very brief introduction to perhaps something that I will say a little bit more about. Should we just go back one? Tomorrow in discussions. Metaethics, the concern of languages of morals, raises some quite interesting questions about whether we actually do have moral values, and if so, how do we have them? Do indeed we have anything to say about particular landscapes, or dare one say, particular architectures? How do we ascribe meaning and value to this particular landscape, designated as a recreation area in California, as against this particular architecture, this particular place, Val de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen, in or near Madrid. And this raises the ways in which, and I'm sure some people in this audience would give greater value to one or other of the places. So we therefore have a competing set of claims actually to what matters, indeed to truth and knowledge. And I think this has widely been accepted by geographers who've been developing an interest in social theory. But, oops, no, it's already on there, we've jumped on to, yes, you're moving me ahead, quite correct, keep me to time or more or less. There is still the postmodern challenge to overarching grand theory, that all that matters is the individual. To what extent is that compatible with arguments over universal normative truths? And I rather like this idea of private landscapes. I would love to have known what was actually behind that. I didn't have time to go in. But in essence, the question that I want to draw towards a conclusion with is this Ben Habib's question of, can any kind of moral universalism be reconciled with any kind of contextual sensitivity? So I think that raises the basic question of what is the difference that a place makes. I've tried to give a number of examples of this in this evening's lecture. But it also raises the question of how any kind of universalism relating to place can be grounded. And very, very briefly, I think geographers who've been looking at this have shifted to the positions I've raised here. Absolutism is by and large totally out of the window, which makes me actually want to argue the case for trying to look at some absolutes, just to play a devil's advocate. But absolutes, if they exist, have to be based on some kind of reference to an external certainty. Locke got round this by advocating the pursuit of some kind of divine law of nature that was God-given. Few people would hold to that today. But universals might also be based on some kind of comparative descriptive ethics derived from arguments such as those that I began this evening with. The most promising lines of argument is work done by David Smith, who examines some of Walser's ideas on this balance between the individual, the particular, and the universal, by talking about thin and thick moralities. And I think there is some useful work to be developed out of this. Walser suggests that thin means some kind of minimalist universal morality, whereas thick focuses in very much on particular and local moralities. And this is where David Smith draws geographers back into the argument. Because he argues that geographers' traditional preoccupation with diversity of human life can be applied to moral thought and practice as well, providing we're aware of the old axiom that the observation of differences from place to place does not deny that there might be some things in common. I apologize for rather rushing these final couple of slides, but let us try and draw some conclusions. This was deliberately not a lecture that had any certainty in it. It was meant to be a lecture to raise a series of questions at the interface between ethics and place. In a sense, it was something that geographers have been condemned for doing in the past, exploring and only exploring. But I've tried to pursue three themes. Firstly, to draw attention to descriptive ethics of place, the ways in which particular places have cultural constructions. Here is windmills on the island of Saaremaa in Estonia, seen as being a highly valued cultural product, a place that retained Estonian identity throughout the period of Soviet occupation, but a place that is paradoxically now being profoundly challenged by liberal democracy and the market economy. Secondly, I've drawn attention to issues relating to normative ethics and place, and focus particularly on moral geographies, the moralities of again, an Estonian example, Soviet missile base, but also the ways in which different kinds of places are created by different kinds of activity, and also distant places. And then, towards the end, I touched very briefly on meta-ethics and place, on ideas of relativism and universalism that I would dearly like to pursue further. 2 final points. I've tried to reassert the value of ethics. Ethics is very, very important in the way not only in which we understand particular places, but also, I suggest, in the way in which we actually understand ourselves. And I will leave you with rather an interesting ethical and moral card, a 1911 illustration of the place of the Jungfrau in Switzerland. And just finish with this final set of questions. I think the postmodern challenge raises very, very profound questions as to whether we indeed have any right at all to make places better. My concern with distant places, with distant strangers, suggests that I am still tied very, very much with an Enlightenment tradition, that I do believe we have a right to make places better. And I believe that many architects feel that as well. Otherwise, we might as well pack up our bags and go home. But that then leads us on to the final question. How actually do we ground our moral principles of place? Sorry I've gone on a little longer. I hope I've given you some food for thought.
Okay, well, we've got a bit of time for questions. But there is a problem which I think maybe we could just sort of sort out now. When we set up this lecture, it was last summer, and with the best will in the world, one tries to find time during the term, when kind of people are around. Now, obviously, a large number of units have trips at the moment, and I noticed today places kind of pretty deserted, that which you absolutely can't predict in the summer. What I'm wondering, therefore, is whether we should stick to the proposal to have the seminar tomorrow, or whether we should find a date